Hank and Addie Beaufort at 74 and 73, after 51 years of marriage and a quiet life of teaching and nursing in the hills above Malden, West Virginia, had believed that family meant the people who showed up when you needed them. They were wrong. After Addie's stroke 2 years before, their only son Brent had stepped in to manage things. He had moved them out of their family home of 40 years, sold the house for less than market, and moved them into a tidy beige condo where everything was already decided. They weren't just helped, they were managed, as if a marriage that had survived 51 winters could be packaged into a one-bedroom and forgotten. When Hank saw the estate auction listing for the abandoned 1880s salt works on Salt Lick Branch, the very salt works his great-uncle Otis had run for half a century, he and Addie scraped together $400 from a private savings account Brent did not control, and they bought it. Brent learned at Thanksgiving. He laughed in front of the whole family, his sister, Addie's sister, the grandchildren, and said, "$400 on a poison pit, Mom? You should have asked me first." But what Brent had never understood about great-uncle Otis was that the old salt master had been writing the family's truth into the brine cellar walls for 50 years, and the man who hid it had known somehow that one day his great-nephew's son would need to be reminded who the Beauforts really were. If you've ever been managed by someone who was supposed to love you, if you've been laughed at by your own children for trusting your own heart, if you've stood in a thrift store living room and wondered whether 51 years of choices had been a quiet kind of mistake, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Hank and Addie Beaufort found beneath the rotted floor of that brine cellar will make you believe that 51 years of love builds a foundation no son's contempt can ever bury. Welcome to the last chapter. The Thanksgiving table sat under a brass chandelier in Brent and Tiffany's 6-bedroom home outside Charleston. The linen pressed so flat it looked starched into stone. Hank sat in his dark brown wool barn coat folded neatly over the back of his chair, his plaid red and charcoal flannel shirt buttoned to the second button, his gold wire rim reading glasses pushed up on his forehead the way he always wore them when he was trying to listen carefully. Addie sat beside him in her cream cable-knit cardigan with the brown leather buttons, her silver hair gathered into the low chignon she had worn for 40 years, her gold-rimmed glasses resting on the chain against her chest. The brown leather suitcase she had carried since their honeymoon sat in the entryway because she had refused to leave it in the car. $400 on a poison pit, Mom, Brent said, leaning back, his sharp gray-blue eyes sweeping the table for laughter. You should have asked me first. That land's condemned. The county wouldn't even let you build a chicken coop on it. Tiffany laughed her brittle laugh, the one that landed somewhere between a cough and a wind chime. Imagine, Hank, going out there in those boots. You'll catch tetanus from the air. The grandchildren, who loved their grandfather's slow-spoken history lessons, looked down at their plates. Addie's sister, Marlene, set her fork down very gently. Hank's hazel eyes lifted, calm, observant, as they had been across 38 years of high school classrooms. He didn't speak. He had taught long enough to know that some sentences earn more from silence than from answer. Addie reached for Hank's hand under the table. Her warm brown eyes were steady. Pass the cranberries, please, sweetheart. The drive home took an hour and a half through the dark hollows. Hank kept both hands on the wheel. Addie watched the headlights wash the bare hardwoods. sycamore, beech, sugar maple, and her thumb traced the brass clasp of the suitcase on her lap. Neither of them spoke. The condo waited at the end of the drive, beige and tidy, with the thermostat already set by an app on Brent's phone. Inside, Addie hung her long forest green wool coat on the hook Brent had installed, and stood for a long moment in the kitchen that did not feel like hers. Hank put the kettle on. The kettle was new. Everything was new. "We should still go look at it," Addie said quietly, her voice firm in the way it had been firm the night her stroke had ended, and she had told the doctor she would walk out of that hospital on her own feet. "It belongs to us now." Hank turned. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses, then pushed them up onto his forehead. "Tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Bring the thermos. I'll pack sandwiches. And I'll bring the suitcase." "Why the suitcase, Ad?" She smiled, the small private smile she had worn the day they were married in 1973. "Because it knows the way to anywhere worth going." He nodded once, slow, and turned off the kitchen light. They went to bed in the room that did not feel like theirs and lay listening to the furnace cycle, holding hands across the gap between the twin beds Brent had ordered. And somewhere outside, in a hollow they had not yet seen, a brine spring kept trickling the way it had trickled since before either of them was born. The next morning, the fog came up out of the hollows, the way fog had come up out of the hollows for 200 years, soft and slow, settling into every cleft of the Kanawha Valley like the breath of something patient. Hank's old gray pickup turned off the county road onto a gravel track that wound between hardwood trunks, the leaves on the ground a wet quilt of bronze and burnt orange. Addie sat beside him with the thermos between her knees and the brown leather suitcase upright on the floorboard, the brass clasps gleaming where she had polished them at 4 in the morning because she could not sleep. The salt works appeared at the end of the road, like a memory the land had been waiting to give back. The brine pump house leaned against itself, half collapsed, its weathered planks the color of old pewter. 3 open side drying sheds stood in a row with sagging tin roofs that had given up on being roofs and become something more like prayers. A line of long wooden evaporation pans sat rotten in a clearing, their staves loose, their iron bands rusted to lace. Behind the pump house, low against the hillside, the stone-walled brine cellar squatted with a heavy oak door grown over with creeper. A small clear brine spring trickled somewhere off to the left, its sound like a thread of silver pulled through the fog. Hank cut the engine. For a long minute neither of them moved. Then Hank pushed his glasses up onto his forehead, opened the door, and stepped out into a place his great-uncle Otis Beaufort had walked every morning for 50 years. "Lord," Addie said softly, "it's still here." "Most of it," Hank said. He helped her down. She set the suitcase carefully on a flat stone and stood with her hands folded over the brass clasp the way a woman stands at a graveside, except this was not a grave. This was an inheritance the family had forgotten how to read. Hank walked the clearing slowly, naming things the way a history teacher names things, half to Addie and half to the air. "Those are settling pans. Otis would have raked them at sunrise. The drying sheds caught the noon sun. The pump house pulled brine up from the spring through a wooden pipe. He would have started his day in that cellar, checking the iron content, writing it down." "You sound like you remember it," Addie said. "I remember reading about it. My senior thesis. 1880s Kanawha salt economy. I wrote 30 pages on Otis Beaufort's pans without ever telling Brent his great-great-uncle was the source. Hank stopped. The fog moved around his boots. I should have told him. You told him 1,000 things, Henry. Addie's voice was warm. He chose not to hear. She sat on a stump and unwrapped 2 egg salad sandwiches from a paper bag. They ate in silence as a red-tailed hawk drifted across the gap of gray sky above the clearing. The thermos coffee steamed. Addie's sturdy brown walking shoes were already soaked through with dew, and she did not seem to mind. "Hello, the holler," came a voice through the brush, big and bright. "Anybody home that ain't a ghost?" A small, fierce-looking woman in a barn coat and rubber boots came shouldering through the bramble at the edge of the clearing, her gray hair tied back with a red bandana, her cheeks ruddy from the walk. She stopped when she saw them and put both hands on her hips. "Well, by all that's holy, you'd be Otis's nephew. You got his eyes." "Great-nephew," Hank said. "Henry Beaufort. This is my wife, Addie. Lurleen Hatfield from over the next holler. Knew your uncle the last 20 years of his life. He used to bring me pickled beans every September." She crossed the clearing in 4 strides and folded Addie into a hug that smelled like wood smoke and apple butter. "Sweetheart, I'm glad someone with sense bought it. The county was fixing to bulldoze it next spring." Addie laughed, a little wet, a little surprised. "Bulldoze it?" "For a parking lot. Some Charleston outfit was sniffing around. I wouldn't trust 'em to feed a stray cat." Lurleen's sharp eyes went to Hank's face and stayed there. "You look just like him. You know, same cowlick on the side part. Otis used to fight that cowlick every morning of his life." Hank touched the side of his head, where the salt and pepper gray rebelled against him. He smiled, slow. "He lost that fight too, did he?" "Every morning till 1958. Lurleen's voice softened. "He went easy, in his sleep in the cottage up the rise. 71 years old. Heart just stopped one March night. Whole holler turned out for the burial." Addie's hand found Hank's. Hank nodded slow. "You folks come back tomorrow?" Lurleen asked. "Tomorrow," Hank said. "We'd like to see the cellar." "You bring a flashlight," Lurleen said. "And you take your time. Otis didn't do anything that didn't have a reason." She turned to go, then stopped. "And honey, if a black Range Rover comes up that road, you don't owe it a smile." She walked back into the brush. The fog took her in. Addie looked at Hank. Hank looked at the cellar door. In his pocket, the cell phone Brent had bought him began to buzz. The screen said Brent. Hank looked at it for 3 rings, then 4, then 5, and slid it back into his pocket without answering. "Tomorrow," Addie said. "Tomorrow," Hank agreed. The cellar door creaked the way a door creaks when no one has asked it a question in 70 years. Hank put his shoulder to it, and it gave with a sigh of iron and salt and time, and a smell rolled out that Addie said later reminded her of the inside of an old church, mineral and patient, and somehow alive. Hank's flashlight beam swept the room. Stone walls, cool to the touch, fitted without mortar in some places, careful as a Pennsylvania quilt. A long wooden table in the center, its top thick with dust the color of cornmeal. Rusted brine pans stacked against one wall. A spool of decayed rope in the far corner. And on the table, a leather-bound logbook, its cover cracked, its spine still whole, its pages waiting. "Henry," Addie whispered, "I see it." Hank stepped in carefully, the boards underfoot soft but holding. He swept the beam slowly. Above them, a heavy oak ceiling beam had fallen at some point, pinning a corner of the floor and burying whatever lay beneath. From under the beam, a curve of dark leather peeked out, no bigger than the palm of a hand. Addie knelt slowly, the way a nurse kneels, the way a woman who had survived a stroke kneels, careful with her hips, careful with her balance. Hank crouched beside her and braced the beam with his shoulder while she eased the leather free. It was a small journal, no thicker than a deck of cards, wrapped in oilcloth that had darkened almost to black with age. Addie's hands shook a little as she peeled the cloth back. The cover read, in a careful hand, O. Beaufort, 1957. Hank opened it. The first page made him sit down on the dirt floor. He read it once, silently. Then he read it aloud, his voice low and even, the voice he had used in classrooms for 38 years. For the one who loves the salt enough to come back, the brine remembers what the family forgets. Addie put her hand over her mouth. The flashlight beam wavered on the wall. Outside, the brine spring kept trickling, soft and silver, the way it had trickled the morning Otis Beaufort had wrapped this journal in oilcloth and slid it under a beam he must have known would one day fall. He knew, Addie whispered. Henry, he knew somebody would come. He knew somebody would need to, Hank said. They did not open the rest of the journal that day. Addie said it felt like reading a letter at a funeral, and Hank agreed. They wrapped it back in the oilcloth, set it inside the brown leather suitcase between two folded handkerchiefs, and walked out of the cellar into a noon sun that had finally burned the fog off the holler. Hank closed the cellar door and set a flat stone against it, the way he had seen his father set stones against barn doors when he was a boy. They came back the next morning, and the morning after, and the morning after that. They came back with notebooks and a camera and a small folding table Hank set up just inside the cellar door. They came back with a thermos and egg salad sandwiches in the suitcase. Always the suitcase, because Addie said the suitcase had become a kind of altar to the things they were learning to honor. Hank approached the work the way he had approached every history project of his life, with patience and with index cards. He photographed every artifact before he moved it. He labeled each photograph with the date, the location in the cellar, and a short description in his careful teacher's hand. He drew a rough map of the cellar floor and numbered each grid square. He noted the fall of light from the high slit window. He noted the depth of the dust on the table, because dust, he told Addie, was a kind of clock. Addie worked beside him with the discipline of a woman who had run a hospital ward for 41 years. She made a small notepad her catalog with columns for object, condition, location, and observations. She handled each piece with the gentle, methodical hands of a nurse, changing a dressing, and she wiped each one with a clean cotton cloth before laying it on a square of brown paper she had cut to size. When she found a small tin of rusted nails in a corner, she did not throw them out. She labeled them. When she found a fragment of pencil with teeth marks on the unsharpened end, she wrote in her round nurse's hand, Otis chewed pencils. Marlene's father did the same. Beaufort men, possibly genetic. Hank laughed when he read that. Then he wrote it on his own index card. They worked for 6 days. They found the rusted brine pans had been stacked in a deliberate order, smallest to largest, and that the largest one, when Hank tipped it carefully, had a false bottom held in place by 4 hand-cut wooden pegs. Hank didn't pry it open. He photographed it, drew it, measured it, and set it aside, because he wanted to open it with witnesses. Addie agreed. They found a row of glass bottles on a shelf, each labeled in a faded copper plate hand. Brine 1912 spring, brine 1923 autumn, brine 1934 August. They counted 42 bottles. Addie wrote, Otis was running an experiment that lasted longer than most marriages. They found the saltmaster's apron hung on a peg, its fabric stiffened with the ghost of 50 years of brine, the pocket still holding a small pencil stub and a folded square of paper that turned out to be a list of birthdays. Hank's father's name was on it. Hank's name was on it, in a hand that must have written it the year Hank was born. Addie set the apron back on its peg and did not say anything for a long time. They found, behind a loose stone in the back wall, a small leather pouch containing 7 silver dollars and a folded note. For the boy who finds this, get yourself a good supper and remember where you came from. O.B. Hank put the pouch in his coat pocket and patted it twice, the way a man pats a child's shoulder. By the 6th morning, the cellar had begun to feel less like a tomb and more like a workshop someone had stepped out of for a moment and would be back any second. Addie said it out loud one afternoon, eating her sandwich on the threshold. He's still here, isn't he? In the way the light falls. He left it tidy, Hank said. He left it tidy on purpose. That afternoon, Lurleen came back, and she brought her grandson Wyatt. Wyatt Hatfield was 28, tall, lean, with his grandmother's sharp eyes and a battered canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. He worked, Lurleen said, for the West Virginia Cultural Center. He had grown up in this holler. He had read every book Hank had ever assigned at the county high school, including the year Hank taught him in 10th grade. Mr. Beaufort, Wyatt said, taking Hank's hand, I've been waiting half my career to see the inside of this cellar. Then come in, son, Hank said. Wyatt walked the room slowly. He stopped at the brine bottles. He stopped at the apron. He stopped at the leather journal Addie had laid open on the table. He read the first line aloud, the line Hank had read aloud 6 days before, and his voice caught on the word remembers. Mr. Beaufort, he said, this is one of the most intact 1880s solar evaporation works in the eastern United States. And that journal, if it's what I think it is a primary source the state historians have been hunting for 60 years. Lurleen crossed her arms. I told you, sweetheart. I told you he had sense. Wyatt called Cheryl Mosby that evening. Cheryl came the next morning, 68 years old, retired county clerk, a small, careful woman in a navy blazer and pearl earrings, who had known Otis in the last decade of his life and had filed the deed to this very land in 1955 with her own hand as a young clerk's apprentice. Cheryl walked the cellar the way Wyatt had walked it, slow, reverent, and when she saw the journal, she sat down on the threshold and cried into a folded handkerchief. He told me once, she said, when she could speak, that he was leaving the truth where the brine could keep it. I thought he meant a sermon. I didn't know he meant a deed. Hank looked at her sharp. A deed? Cheryl nodded slowly, dabbing her eyes. Henry, I think you better look in that big brine pan, the one with the wooden pegs. Before Hank could answer, gravel crunched up the road. A black Range Rover, Tiffany in the passenger seat, Brent at the wheel, a manila folder in his hand. The Range Rover stopped at the edge of the clearing. Brent stepped out in his gray wool pea coat and brown leather brogues, the brogues already wrong for the gravel, his sharp gray-blue eyes scanning the property the way a man scans a balance sheet. Tiffany followed in a cream designer puffer coat that did not match anything in the holler. Mom, Dad, Brent called, his smooth voice carrying across the clearing. I need to talk to you. Wyatt looked at Hank. Hank looked at Addie. Addie looked at the wooden box, which they had carried up from beneath the false bottom of the largest brine pan only 20 minutes before, and which now sat unopened on the cellar table, its lid still sealed with a strip of waxed twine Otis Beaufort had tied in 1957. Slide it behind the cabinet, Wyatt said quietly. He moved with the calm of a young man who had grown up in this holler and knew what cellar shadows could hide. The box vanished behind the old oak cabinet that had once held salt scales. Hank pushed the cabinet half an inch back into place. Addie put her hand on his arm. Her hand was steady. Her brown eyes were not afraid. They walked out into the clearing together, the four of them, with Cheryl behind. Brent took 2 steps forward, the manila folder lifted slightly. "Mom, Dad, we need to be reasonable here." "Hello, Brent," Hank said. He pushed his glasses up onto his forehead. "Hello, Tiffany." Tiffany did not answer. Her brittle laugh was nowhere. Her face was the face of a woman who had been told something on the drive up that she had not wanted to hear. "Look," Brent said, opening the folder. "I've spoken with my partners. We're prepared to offer $50,000 for this parcel. Today. Cash equivalent. You'd walk away with more than 100 times what you paid. We can have papers drawn up by the end of the week. It's the right thing for you. It's the right thing for everyone." Hank looked at the folder. He looked at his son. He looked for a long moment at a hawk that had drifted into the gap of gray sky above the clearing. The same hawk, perhaps, that Addie had watched on their first morning here. "No, son," Hank said. His voice was calm. It was the voice he had used when a 10th grader asked him a question that deserved a real answer. "We're not selling. Dad, be reasonable. This place is a hazard. The county already condemned it. You're going to fall through a floor." "We're not selling, Brent," Addie said. Her voice was warm. It was also iron. "The land belongs to your father. It always did." Brent's face moved through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and something tighter. Something that looked, from the side, almost like fear. "What do you mean it always did?" "We mean," Cheryl Mosby said, stepping forward in her navy blazer, "that some county records go back further than a man's plans. Mr. Beaufort, if you'd like to schedule a meeting at the courthouse, I'd be glad to arrange it." Brent's hand tightened on the folder. The contract crumpled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Tiffany touched his elbow. "Brent, we should go." "Mom." "We'll see you at Christmas, sweetheart," Addie said, and her smile was the smile of a woman who had nursed 3,000 patients through worse mornings than this one. "Drive safe down the gravel." The Range Rover backed down the road with more care than it had come up. The sound of it faded into the hollow. The hawk circled once and was gone. Hank stood very still for a long minute, his hand on the small of Addie's back, the way it had rested there for 51 years. "Inside," Wyatt said quietly. "Let's open the box." The wooden box sat on the cellar table in a square of pale October light from the high slit window. It was no bigger than a family Bible. The wood a dark walnut gone almost black with age. The corners reinforced with hand-cut iron, strapping that had rusted to the color of dried tobacco. The lid was sealed with a strip of wax twine and a dab of dark wax pressed with the imprint of a small star. The same star, Wyatt said, that had been Otis Beaufort's saltmaster's mark on every barrel that left the works between 1908 and 1958. Hank stood at the table with one hand on the lid and the other hand reaching back without looking, the way it always reached back without looking, to find Addie. Her hand met his. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Wyatt held the lantern. Lurleen stood by the door with her arms crossed and her ruddy face still. Cheryl had set her notepad and her pen on the corner of the table and folded her hands in front of her like a woman in a pew. Outside, the brine spring kept trickling, soft and silver, indifferent to what any of them did next. "Henry," Addie said very quietly, "take your time." He did. He stood for a long minute. He looked at the star pressed into the wax. He looked at the iron strapping. He looked at the slit of light moving across the floor. He thought, He told her later about the day he had married her in 1973 in a Methodist chapel that smelled like beeswax, and about the day Brent had been born in 1979 in a hospital where Addie had worked the night shift 2 days before her water broke, and about the day his father had sat him down on the porch in 1991 and told him, "Son, when something is yours, you don't argue about it. You just stand on it." "All right," Hank said. He took a small pocket knife from his coat. He cut the twine. The wax cracked. The lid lifted with a soft sigh, like the cellar door, like the holler itself, like a man finally exhaling after holding his breath for 68 years. Inside, on top, lay a thick, leather-bound volume. Hank lifted it carefully. The cover read, in the same careful copper plate hand, "Saltmaster's Complete Ledger, Otis Beaufort, 1908 to 1958. Wyatt drew in a breath that he held for a long time. Hank opened the ledger. Page after page after page of careful entries. Brine purity readings to 4 decimal places, weather observations, market prices of salt in Charleston, in Pittsburgh, in Cincinnati, notes on the men who came to buy and the men who came to swindle, notes on the spring weeks when the brine ran weak and the autumn weeks when it ran strong, and, threaded through the columns of numbers, a quiet running commentary on the family, the year Hank's grandfather had married, the year Hank's father had been born, the year Otis had taken in a niece who had been widowed young and given her a year's wages from the salt and never written it as a debt. The leather binding of the ledger was a deep ox blood, rubbed almost to suede along the spine, where Otis's thumb had opened it 10,000 times across half a century. Hank turned the first page slowly, and the smell that lifted out was cedar and old lamp oil and the faintest mineral note of dried brine. The smell, Addie said later, of a man's whole working life pressed between 2 leather covers. The first page bore Otis's dedication in copperplate ink, so careful it looked engraved. Begun this 12th day of March, 1908, by Otis Beaufort, Saltmaster of Salt Lick Branch, with the prayer that what is written here will outlast the writer. Hank's hands trembled from the small private earthquake that runs through a history teacher when a primary source breathes against his fingers. Addie put on her gold-rimmed glasses and read the dedication aloud in a voice that found Otis's cadence without trying, and the cellar held the words the way a stone wall holds a hymn. Addie pressed her fingers to her mouth. "Discovery one," Wyatt whispered, almost to himself. "A complete 50-year Saltmaster's ledger. There are maybe 3 of these in the entire country." Beneath the ledger lay a sealed cardboard tube. Hank opened it carefully. He drew out a roll of stiff yellowed papers, unrolled them on the table, and set the lantern at one corner to hold them flat. They were patent application drawings. United States Patent Office, 1922. Inventor, Otis Beaufort, Malden, West Virginia. Title, Improved Solar Evaporation Salt Purification Process. The drawings were precise, careful, beautiful, the kind of drawings a man makes when he knows what he is doing and loves the doing of it. There were 6 sheets. There was a written specification in Otis's hand. There was a stamp from the patent examiner's office. "He filed it," Hank said, almost to himself. "He filed it and never did anything with it." "He didn't have to," Cheryl said softly. "He had what he needed. He just wanted the record to exist." Wyatt's hand was trembling slightly. "Mr. Beaufort, this patent, even unrenewed, is a primary historical document for Appalachian industrial heritage. The state archives will weep when they see this." Wyatt knelt at the corner of the table the way a young priest kneels at a relic. and Hank watched the heritage preservationist in him forget for a moment that he had a job title. When Wyatt tipped the drawings free of the tube, the paper unrolled across the cellar table with the slow obedience of something that had been waiting to be looked at. Hank set the lantern at one corner and a river stone at the other, and the schematics opened in pale yellow planes. Otis had drawn a tiered evaporation system that drew brine through 3 sequential pans of descending salinity, with a charcoal and sandstone filter bed between the second and third stages, and a wooden lid that closed automatically when the autumn rains came. The lines were ruled to the 16th of an inch, the cross-sections shaded with the patient hatchet of a man who had taught himself drafting from a mail-order book. He was trying to invent a salt that would compete with Liverpool imports, Wyatt said quietly. He was trying to save the Kanawha salt industry with a porch-built process and a homemade pencil. Addie touched the edge of the drawing the way she would have touched a newborn's hand. Lurleen cleared her throat then, the small rough cough she used when a memory had ambushed her. She lowered herself onto the stump Hank had dragged in for a seat, her ruddy cheeks wet, though she did not seem to notice. "My grandmother Etta worked these drying sheds with Otis," she said, 2 summers before she married my granddaddy. She used to tell me he whistled the same 4 bars all morning, some old Methodist tune, and she could time her rakings by the chorus. He never raised his voice at a worker, not once, and he gave every girl on the line a clean apron every Monday, because a salt maker who looked tidy made tidy salt. The summer she turned 20, she dropped a wooden scoop into the number 3 pan and cried because she thought he'd dock her. Otis fished it out himself, dried it on his own apron, and told her, "Etta, the brine doesn't punish a clean mistake. Neither do I." 3 days before she died, she made me promise that if anybody ever bought this works, I'd tell them she had been here. Lurleen wiped her eyes. "So I'm telling you, she'd be glad as anything that you came back." Beneath the patent tube lay a flat leather portfolio tied with a black ribbon. Hank untied the ribbon. The portfolio opened. Inside lay a thick stack of folded papers, each one stamped, sealed, and signed. Deeds, original deeds. Hank lifted the top one. He read it. He set it down. He lifted the next. He read it. He set it down. Addie watched his face. Cheryl came around the table and read over his shoulder, and her eyes widened, and her lips moved as she counted. "Henry," Cheryl whispered, "do you understand what you're holding?" "Tell me," Hank said. Otis purchased 600 acres of this hollow, parcel by parcel, between 1918 and 1957. 40 years of small purchases. He never sold a single acre. He held it all under his own name, and his will, which I filed in 1958 as a young clerk, named your father as primary heir and your father's heirs in succession. Henry, those acres pass through you." Addie sat down on the threshold. Lurleen sat down beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. 600 acres, Hank said. "The whole holler," Wyatt said. Beneath the deeds, at the very bottom of the box, Hank lifted out one last item. It was a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed but intact, the front written in Otis's careful hand, "For the Beauforts who come after me. Otis." Hank held it for a long moment. Then he handed it, gently, to Addie, because she had earned it, because she had carried the suitcase up the road every morning of the past week, because she had told him on a cold November night in a beige condo, we should still go look at it. Addie opened the envelope with hands that were steady. She unfolded 2 pages covered in the same copper plate hand. She put on her gold-rimmed glasses. She read, and her warm voice carried in the cellar, and the cellar listened. To the Beauforts who come after me, if you are reading this letter, then you have walked into the brine cellar with reason in your heart, and the salt has chosen to speak to you. I have worked these pans for 50 years. I have watched men try to take this land 3 times in my life. I have watched them fail 3 times. The land is not theirs. It belongs to the family that knew its name before there were roads to it. There will come a time, after I am gone, when a Beaufort will be made to feel small by a Beaufort. When that day comes, the brine cellar will tell you what no lawyer ever could. Stand on what is yours. Feed the apprentices. Keep the spring clear. Love the woman who walked the gravel with you. Addie's voice broke on the last sentence. She lowered the page. The cellar was quiet, except for the brine spring trickling outside, soft and silver. The way it had trickled the morning Otis had folded these pages into this envelope and placed them in this box, and set this box beneath the false bottom of the largest brine pan, and walked out of this cellar for the last time in March of 1958. Love the woman who walked the gravel with you, Hank said. He pushed his glasses up onto his forehead. He was not crying, exactly. His hazel eyes were just full. He knew you, Ad. He never met you, and he knew you. He knew her kind, Lurleen said. Her voice was rough. Beaufort men have always known her kind. Cheryl folded her hands and bowed her head once. Wyatt set the lantern down very gently on the table, as if any sudden movement might startle the moment out of the room. There was one more thing none of them said for a long minute. They did not need to say it. They were all thinking it. 600 acres, patent, ledger, letter. And outside, on a county road 2 hollows away, a black Range Rover was driving south toward Charleston with a manila folder of plans that no longer had a foundation. Mr. Beaufort, Wyatt said quietly, there's one more thing you should know. I checked with my office last week. The West Virginia Historic Preservation Office has a pending grant offer for the salt works, $1.6 million, for restoration, conditional on the works remaining in family ownership and being operated as a living history site. Hank looked at Addie. Addie looked at Hank. The brine spring kept trickling. Discovery 4, Wyatt said softly. The full scope. Your son's resort needed this hollow to survive. He didn't know you owned it. He thought it was condemned county land he could pick up at auction. He spent 3 years assembling the surrounding parcels through his Charleston firm. Without this hollow, his keystone attraction collapses. And the grant your family qualifies for, Mr. Beaufort, is more than 4 times what he offered you. Lurleen whistled low. Otis, Hank said, almost to the air. Otis, you old fox. Cheryl Mosby filed the deeds at the Kanawha County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of November. She wore the same navy blazer and pearl earrings she had worn the day she walked the cellar, and she filed each deed with her own hand, and the young clerk who stamped them did not yet understand that he was stamping the end of one story and the beginning of another. By Tuesday afternoon, 600 acres of the Salt Lick Branch Hollow were formally recorded in the name of Henry Beaufort, sole heir under the will of Otis Beaufort, deceased March 1958. By Tuesday evening, the news had reached Charleston. By Wednesday morning, Brent's resort partners had begun making the kind of phone calls that begin with, "I'm sure there's a simple explanation," and end with, "We'll need to revisit the term sheet." By Wednesday afternoon, the term sheet was dead. Brent arrived at the beige condo on Thursday at 4 in the afternoon. He came alone. There was no Tiffany in the passenger seat, no manila folder in his hand, no smooth, condescending voice rehearsed in the rearview mirror. He came in his gray wool peacoat that had been cleaned recently for a different occasion, and his brown leather brogues that had begun to wear at the heel, and when Addie opened the door, His sharp, gray-blue eyes were red around the edges. "Mom," he said, "can I come in?" "Come in, son," she said. He sat on the beige sofa Tiffany had picked out 2 years before. Hank sat in the armchair across from him, with his hands folded over his knees, his plaid flannel shirt buttoned to the second button, his hazel eyes calm. Addie sat beside Hank on the arm of his chair, the way she had sat beside him on the arm of every chair for 51 years. "Dad," Brent said, "I want to make my case. I want to talk about a partnership. The Hollow doesn't have to be a parking lot. It could be a heritage attraction, co-managed, family-owned. We could—" "Brent," Addie said very gently, "before you keep talking, I want you to listen to something." She took the 2 folded pages out of the brown leather suitcase. She put on her gold-rimmed glasses. She read the last paragraph of Otis Beaufort's letter aloud, the same paragraph she had read in the cellar a week before, her voice as steady as it had been then. "Stand on what is yours. Feed the apprentices. Keep the spring clear. Love the woman who walked the gravel with you." Brent's face moved. It moved the way a face moves when a man hears a sentence he has needed to hear for 20 years and never knew he needed. His shoulders came down. His hands came open. His eyes filled. "Mom," he said. His voice was small. "I'm sorry." "I know, son," Addie said. "I thought I was helping you." "I know. I thought you were—" He stopped. He looked at his father. "I thought you were going to break, and I wouldn't know how to fix it." "We weren't going to break, son," Hank said. "We were going to bend. There's a difference. You could have asked us which one we were doing." Brent put his face in his hands. He cried quietly the way grown men cry, which is to say without much sound. Hank did not stand up to comfort him, because Hank had been a teacher long enough to know that some sorrows were medicine, and the medicine had to finish. After a long minute, Brent looked up. "What can I do?" "You can come home for Christmas," Addie said. "You can drive the gravel road. You can meet the apprentices when we have them. And you can tell your sister she's invited too. And Tiffany. Tiffany's welcome any time she chooses to come without the puffer coat in her tone." Brent laughed once, wet and surprised. He nodded. He stood up to go, and at the door, he paused. "We're not selling, Brent," Hank said gently. "I know, Dad. And we're not partnering either. The Hollow belongs to a family, and the family includes you, but the Hollow is not a deal." "I understand. Drive safe." He drove away. The Range Rover was already not his, although he didn't know it yet. The repossession notice would arrive on Friday morning because his commercial real estate firm had filed for bankruptcy reorganization on Thursday at noon, and because the regulatory review of his license had begun on Thursday at 1, and because the resort partners who had pulled out on Wednesday had also pulled out of 3 other deals in his portfolio, and because Tiffany, whose name was on 3 of his accounts, had moved her own accounts to a separate bank that morning without telling him. By the second week of December, Brent's company was in court-supervised reorganization. By the third week, his license was suspended pending review. By the fourth week, 2 of his Charleston colleagues had filed complaints about land acquisition practices that did not survive the kind of scrutiny that follows a public failure. By January, the Charleston papers were running the story with a photograph of his office building and a careful headline that did not name him directly, but did not need to. By February, Tiffany had moved into her sister's townhouse in Mount Pleasant, citing what her divorce filing called irreconcilable differences in financial conduct. By March, the Range Rover had been auctioned off the impound lot for less than what Brent had paid for the floor mats. By April, Brent had taken a job teaching business ethics part-time at a community college outside Beckley, which was not a punishment so much as a strange kind of mercy. And the students who took his class did not know that the man at the front of the room had 3 months earlier learned the difference between bending and breaking from his own father. The two principal investors who pulled the rug were Calhoun Whitfield of Whitfield Capital out of Charleston and Reese Tatum of Tatum Holcomb Hospitality out of Greenville, South Carolina. Both had signed onto Brent's project on the strength of his pitch deck for what he had been calling, in glossy renderings, the Beaufort Hollow Heritage Resort. He had branded the entire venture after his own family, without ever asking his parents, and he had slipped the family crest, lifted from a Beaufort Bible none of them had opened in 40 years, onto the upper right corner of every page. When Whitfield pulled out, he sent a single-line letter that read, "We do not invest in projects whose namesakes were not consulted." Tatum's withdrawal came in a phone call that ended in a click. The Charleston firm's commercial real estate license review opened the following Monday, prompted by a complaint Cheryl Mosby had filed in her own name as a retired clerk of court who had personally examined the deeds in question. The fallout in Malden moved slower, in small kindnesses pressed into rough hands. The Tuesday after the Charleston paper named Brent in its second story, Hank stopped at the feed store, and old Cleve Marshall slid a bundle of jerky across the counter and said, "On the house, Mr. Beaufort. I laughed at your boys' jokes about you at the church picnic last summer. I knew better, and I laughed anyway." The same week, Wanda, the waitress at the diner on Malden Pike, refused Addie's money for her buttermilk pie and said, "Honey, we all watched him move you out of that house. We didn't say anything. I'm telling you now we should have." Tiffany filed a separation petition in Charleston County Family Court that Friday, and Addie, reading the brief section, set the paper down and said only, "That girl deserves a kitchen of her own. I hope she finds one." 3 nights after the separation petition went public, the cell phone Brent had bought Hank rang at 9 in the evening, and the screen said, Vivian Beaufort, 19, college freshman at the University of Virginia, was crying so hard that Hank had to ask her twice to slow down. She had read all 4 Charleston pieces in her dorm room and stayed up until 3 in the morning piecing together how her father had moved his grandparents into a beige condo and called it kindness. "Granddaddy," she said, the word she had used since she was 4. "I'm so sorry. I came over that summer he sold your house. And I didn't ask why you were boxing things. I just helped him pack." Hank let her cry for a minute. He pushed his glasses up onto his forehead and said, in the voice that had told 1,000 sophomores that the wrong answer was usually a question that hadn't been asked, "Vivian, you were 18 and you trusted your daddy. That's not a sin. The sin would be staying 18 forever. Your grandmother and I are spending Christmas at the Salt Works. Come up, bring a coat that isn't fashionable. We'll walk the brine spring at dawn, and I'll tell you about your great-great-uncle Otis, and we'll be all right." There was a long quiet on the line. Then Vivian, in a voice that had steadied, said, "Okay, Granddaddy, I'll come." The condo Brent had bought for his parents to manage went on the market in late November. Hank and Addie sold it back at a small loss to the same beige property management company that had sold it to Brent, and they did not look back when the closing papers were signed, and they did not keep the curtain rods. They moved with the brown leather suitcase and 4 cardboard boxes and 1 folding rocking chair into the renovated Saltmaster's cottage on the rise above the brine cellar. The same cottage where Otis Beaufort had died easy in his sleep one March night in 1958. The cottage had 4 rooms and a stone fireplace and a tin roof that sang in the rain, and Addie said, the first morning she made coffee in its kitchen, that she had not understood until that moment what a kitchen was for. The restoration of the salt works took 18 months. The West Virginia Historic Preservation Office grant, $1.6 million, was filed under the family's name, with Wyatt as the project preservationist of record and Cheryl as the documentation lead. The brine pump house was rebuilt plank by plank with timber milled from windfall sycamore on the property. The drying sheds got new tin roofs that did not sag. The wooden evaporation pans were carefully replicated by a cooperative in Lewisburg from drawings in Otis's ledger. The brine cellar itself, Wyatt insisted, would be restored only enough to be safe. The fallen ceiling beam was left exactly where Addie had first knelt beside it. A small brass plaque was set into the stone above the doorway. The plaque read, "The brine remembers what the family forgets." Otis Beaufort, 1957. The works opened to the public on a Saturday morning in May, 2 springs after Hank and Addie had bought it for $400. Lurleen cut the ribbon because Lurleen refused to let anyone else cut the ribbon. The fiddler from the next holler overplayed a tune Otis used to whistle at the pans. Cheryl set up the historical archive in a small room off the pump house, with the original ledger in a humidity-controlled glass case and the patent drawings framed on the wall. Wyatt led the first tour. The first tour was 37 people, including Hank's sister, Addie's sister, 3 grandchildren, and 1 quiet man in a gray wool peacoat who stood at the back and did not say anything, but did not leave either. The Otis Beaufort Salt Works Apprenticeship enrolled 5 young people in its first year. 3 were from the holler. 2 had grown up 2 counties over and had read about the program in a regional paper and written letters in their own hand to the address listed in the back of the article. The apprenticeship ran for 9 months. Apprentices learned solar evaporation, brine chemistry, cooperative basics, and the careful patience of pan raking at sunrise. They were paid a small monthly stipend out of profits from the salt the works produced, which was sold in small cloth bags labeled Beaufort Hollow Salt through artisanal food stores in Charleston, Lewisburg, Asheville, and Pittsburgh. The salt sold faster than the works could make it. Lurleen oversaw the daily operations with a clipboard and a wooden spoon she used for both stirring and gentle authority. Cheryl ran the archive and cataloged every visitor's question because she said one of those questions, eventually, would be the one Otis had been waiting for. Wyatt came up from Charleston every other weekend and said his real job was just the thing he did to fund this one. The 5 apprentices of that first class had names Hank wrote into a small calf-bound notebook he kept on the cottage mantel because he said names mattered more than numbers, and a salt works ran on names. The first was Marley Wilkerson, 20, from Cabin Creek, who had never held a paying job and who turned out, on her second morning, to have a hand for brine chemistry that startled even Wyatt. The second was Elias Bradshaw, 22, son and grandson of Boone County coal miners, who knew tools the way other young men knew song lyrics and rebuilt the pump house gearing in a single weekend. The third was Caroline Caro Witt, 17, who ran the Heritage Center's TikTok account and turned the salt works into a regional curiosity with vertical video and hand-lettered captions. The fourth was Reuben Sayers, 31, an Iraq War veteran who had come back with a bad shoulder and a worse year and who said he wanted to spend the rest of his working life within walking distance of the spring. The fifth was Jonas Stoltzfus, 26, a Mennonite woodworker from up past Lurleen's place, who arrived in a black felt hat and replaced every rotted door frame on the property in a month. The first batch of Beaufort Hollow salt came off the pans on a clear Saturday morning in late June, and Lurleen insisted on a ceremony because she was the kind of woman who knew that small holy moments fell through the floor of a community if nobody set a chair under them. She made the apprentices stand in a half circle around the #1 pan at sunrise and recite what they had learned. She had Cheryl tie a length of red ribbon around the first clay jar. The jars had been thrown by Patience Ennis, a local potter who had stamped the bottom of each one with the same small star Otis had pressed into his wax. Cheryl held a separate ribbon cutting that same afternoon for the archive's permanent gallery. And above the cellar entrance, Hank set a small wooden plaque he had carved himself across 3 winter evenings on the cottage porch. It was sycamore, pale and close-grained, the letters burned in with a heated nail. It read simply, "Brought back, with thanks, the Beauforts who came after." By the second year, there were 8 apprentices. By the third year, there were 11. 2 of the first-year apprentices stayed on as junior salt makers. One of them, a quiet young woman from Boone County, asked Addie one afternoon if she could write a small history of the works for the visitor brochure, and Addie said yes, and the brochure she wrote was the first piece of writing the woman had ever published, and 3 years later she would be admitted to a graduate program in Appalachian Studies on the strength of it. Brent visited once a season. He came in November, in February, in May, and in August. He came alone the first year, with his sister the second year, and with his nephew the third. He never came with Tiffany, because by then the divorce was final, and Tiffany had remarried a Charleston attorney who did not laugh brittle laughs, but did not visit hollows either. Brent walked the works slowly each visit. He stood at the brine cellar doorway and read the plaque every time. He did not go inside. Hank did not press him. Addie did not press him. "Some thresholds," Hank said one evening to Wyatt, "a man has to cross when he is ready, and not before." The evening of the 3rd anniversary of the opening, Hank and Addie sat on the porch of the saltmaster's cottage with 2 mugs of coffee and the brown leather suitcase between them on the floor. The suitcase was empty now, because Otis's letter lived in a glass case in the archive, and the silver dollars had been spent on the first apprentice's first pair of work boots, and the journal lived under a humidity hood beside the ledger. The suitcase still came with them everywhere. "Hank," Addie said. "Muh? Do you think he knew, Otis? Do you think he knew it would be us?" Hank pushed his glasses up onto his forehead. He looked out at the holler. The fog was coming up the way fog had come up for 200 years. The brine spring was trickling somewhere down the slope, soft and silver. A red-tailed hawk drifted across the gap of gray sky. "I think he knew it would be a Beaufort who came back," Hank said. "And I think he hoped it would be a Beaufort with a good woman beside him. And I think when he wrote love, the woman who walked the gravel with you, he was writing a prayer, not a prediction. But I think the prayer found us." Addie reached over and took his hand. The hand was the same hand it had been in 1973 in a Methodist chapel, and in 1979 in a hospital corridor, and in 2024 in a beige condo in Charleston, and on the threshold of a brine cellar one foggy October morning when a journal had said the brine remembers what the family forgets. The hand was older now. It was also more itself than it had ever been. They walked the brine spring at dawn every Sunday after that. They walked it in spring when the red bud was out and the dogwood was just starting, and in summer when the sycamores threw shade like green cathedrals, and in autumn when the sugar maples burned along the ridge, and in winter when the spring still trickled clear under a thin lace of ice. They walked hand in hand, slowly, because Addie's hip was still careful, and Hank's knees were 64 years older than the day he had run the bases at Malden High, and neither of them was in a hurry, because there was nowhere left in the world they needed to be that was not already this hollow. On a Sunday morning in late October, 4 years after the day they had first cut the engine at the end of the gravel road, Hank stopped at the edge of the spring and pushed his glasses up onto his forehead. He looked at his wife of 55 years, in her long forest green wool coat over her cream cable knit cardigan with the brown leather buttons, her silver chignon, her gold-rimmed glasses on the chain at her chest, her warm brown eyes meeting his, and he said, slowly, the way a history teacher says a sentence he has been thinking about for a long time. "Ad, $400. She laughed. It was the laugh she had laughed in 1973, and in 1979, and in every kitchen of every house they had lived in. And it was the laugh she had laughed when Lurleen had hugged her in the clearing on the first foggy morning. It was a laugh that had outlasted a stroke and a son's contempt and a beige condo and a saltmaster's cellar full of ghosts. $400, she said. Best money we ever spent. The fog moved through the holler. The brine spring kept trickling. Somewhere up the slope, a young apprentice was raking a pan at sunrise, and the iron sang against the wood the way it had sung in 1908, and somewhere behind a stone wall in a cellar that had once held a wooden box, the last sentence of an old man's letter was waiting in a glass case for the next Beaufort, or the next Beaufort after that, to read it and remember what blood and salt could hold. Thank you for walking through every step of Hank and Addie's journey, from the polite cruelty of a managed life to the cracked open joy of a salt cellar that finally spoke after 70 years of careful waiting. If their story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been managed by someone who was supposed to love you, if you've been quietly underestimated by your own children, if you've discovered that the years you thought were ordinary were actually the foundation of something extraordinary, leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment you realized that 50 years of small faithfulness can become an inheritance no one can take, because Hank and Addie's story proves that long love builds slow foundations, that the brine remembers what the family forgets, that justice tastes a little like salt at the end of a long Appalachian autumn, and that you are never too old to plant your flag in a hollow you bought with the last $400 in your private savings. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that a quiet life builds a cellar deeper than any ledger, and that the people who manage them never imagined what was waiting underneath. Welcome to the last chapter. We'll see you in the next story.